Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
Galactic Ghost by Walter Cubilius. The Flying Dutchman of space was a harbinger of death, but Willard wasn't superstitious. He had seen the phantom and lived. The only friend in space Willard had ever known was dying. Dobbin's lips were parched and his breath came spasmodically. The tips of his fingers that had so many times caressed the control board of the Mary Lou were now black as meteor dust. "We'll never see Earth again," he whispered feebly, plucked weakly at the cover. "Nonsense," Willard broke in hurriedly, hoping that the dying man would not see through the lie. "We've got the sun's gravity helping us drift back to Earth. We'll be there soon. You'll get well soon, and we'll start to work again on a new idea of mine." His voice trailed helplessly away, and the words were lost. It was no use. The sick man did not hear him. 2 tears rolled down his cheeks. His face contorted as he tried to withhold a sob. "To see Earth again," he said weakly. "To walk on solid ground once more." 4 years, Willard echoed faintly. He knew how his space mate felt. No man can spend 4 years away from his home planet and fail to be anguished. A man could live without friends, without fortune, but no man could live without Earth. He was like Antecedent, for only the feel of the solid ground under his feet could give him courage to go among the stars. Willard also knew what he dared not admit to himself. He too, like Dobbin, would never see Earth again. Perhaps some 1,000 years from now, some lonely wanderers would find their battered hulk of a ship in space and bring them home again. Dobbin motioned to him, and in answer to a last request, Willard lifted him so he faced the port window for a final look at the panorama of the stars. Dobbin's eyes, dimming and half-closed, took in the vast play of the heavens, and in his mind he relived the days when in a frail craft he first crossed interstellar space. But for Earth loneliness, Dobbin would die a happy man, knowing that he had lived as much and as deeply as any man could. Silently the 2 men watched. Dobbin's eyes opened suddenly, and a tremor seized his body. He turned painfully and looked at Willard. "I saw it!" His voice cracked, trembling. "Saw what?" "It's true! It's true! It comes whenever a spaceman dies. It's there!" "In heaven's name, Dobbin," Willard demanded. "What do you see? What is it?" Dobbin lifted his dark, bony arm and pointed out into star-studded space. "The ghost ship!" Something clicked in Willard's memory. He had heard it spoken of in whispers by drunken spacemen and professional tellers of fairy tales, but he had never put any stock in them. In some forgotten corner of Dobbin's mind, the legend of the ghost ship must have lain to come up in this time of delirium. "There's nothing there," he said firmly. "It's come! For me!" Dobbin cried. He turned his head slowly toward Willard, tried to say something, and then fell back upon the pillow. His mouth was open and his eyes stared unseeing ahead. Dobbin was now one with the vanished pioneers of yesterday. Willard was alone. For 2 days, reckoned in Earth time, Willard kept vigil over the body of his friend and spacemate. When the time was up, he did what was necessary, and nothing remained of Harry Dobbin, the best friend he had ever had. The atoms of his body were now pure energy stored away in the useless motors of the Mary Lou. The weeks that followed were like a blur in Willard's mind. Though the ship was utterly incapable of motion, the chance meteor that damaged it had spared the converters and assimilators. Through constant care and attention, the frail balance that meant life or death could be kept. The substance of waste and refuse was torn down and rebuilt as precious food and air. It was even possible to create more than was needed. When this was done, Willard immediately regretted it, for it would be then that the days and the weeks would roll by endlessly. Sometimes he thought he would go mad when sitting at the useless control board, which was his habit. He would stare for hours and hours in the direction of the sun, where he knew the Earth would be. A great loneliness would then seize upon him, him, and an agony that no man had ever known would tear at his heart. He would then turn away, full of despair and hopeless pain. 2 years after Dobbin's death, a strange thing happened. Willard was sitting at his accustomed place, facing the unmoving vista of the stars. A chance glance at Orion's belt froze him still. A star had flickered, distinctly, as if a light veil had been placed over it and then lifted. It dimmed and turned bright again. What strange phenomena was this? He watched, and then another star faded momentarily in the exact fashion, and then a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. Willard's heart gave a leap, and the lethargy of 2 years vanished instantly. Here at last was something to do. It might be only a few minutes before he would understand what it was, but those few minutes would help while away the maddening long hours. Perhaps it was a mass of fine meteorites, or a pocket of gas that did not disperse, or even a moving warp of spacelight. Whatever it was a phenomena worth investigating, and Willard seized upon it as a dying man seizes upon the last flashing seconds of life. Willard traced its course by the flickering stars and gradually plotted its semicircular course. It was not from the solar system, but instead headed towards it. A rapid checkup on his calculations caused his heart to beat in ever-quickening excitement. Whatever it was, it would reach the Mary Lou. Again he looked out the port. Unquestionably, the faint mass was nearing his ship. It was round in shape and almost invisible. The stars, though dimmed, could still be seen through it. There was something about its form that reminded him of an old-fashioned rocket ship. It resembled one of those that had done pioneer service in the lanes 40 years ago or more. Resembled one? It was one, unquestionably. Though half invisible and like a piece of glass immersed in water, it was a rocket ship. But the instruments on the control board could not lie. The presence of any material body within 100,000 miles would be revealed. But the needle on the gauge did not quiver. Nothing indicated the presence of a ship. But the evidence of his eyes was incontestable. Or was it? Doubt gripped him. Did the loneliness of all these years in space twist his mind till he was imagining the appearance of faint ghost-like rocket ships? The thought shot through his mind like a thunderbolt. Ghost ship. Was this the thing that Dobbin had seen before he died? But that was impossible. Ghost ships existed nowhere but in legends and tall tales told by men drunk with the liquors of Mars. There is no ship there. There is no ship there, Willard told himself over and over again as he looked at the vague outline of the ship, now motionless, a few hundred miles away. Deep within him, a faint voice cried, "It's come! For me!" But Willard stilled it. This was no fantasy. There was a scientific reason for it. There must be. Or should there be? Throughout all Earth history, there had been ghost ships sailing the seven seas, ships doomed to roam forever because their crew broke some unbreakable law. If this was true for the ships of the seas, why not for the ships of empty space? He looked again at the strange ship. It was motionless. At least it was not nearing him. Willard could see nothing but its vague outline. A moment later, he could discern a faint motion. It was turning. The ghost ship was turning back. Unconsciously, Willard reached out with his hand as if to hold it back, for when it was gone, he would be alone again. But the ghost ship went on. Its outline became smaller and smaller, fainter and fainter. Trembling, Willard turned away from the window as he saw the rocket recede and vanish into the emptiness of space. Once more, the dreaded loneliness of the stars descended upon him. 7 years passed, and back on Earth in a small newspaper that Willard would never see, there was published a small item. Quote, Arden Rocketport. 13 years ago, the spaceship Mary Lou, under John Willard and Larry Dobbin, left the rocket port for the exploration of an alleged planetoid beyond Pluto. The ship has not been seen or heard from since. J. Willard II, son of the lost explorer, is planning the manufacture of a supersized exploration ship to be called Mary Lou II, in memory of his father. End quote. Memories die hard. A man who is alone in space with nothing but the cold friendship of starlight looks back upon memories as the only things both dear and precious to him. Willard, master and lone survivor of the Mary Lou, knew this well, for he had tried to rip the memories of Earth out of his heart to ease the anguish of solitude within him, but it was a thing that could not be done. And so it was that each night, for Willard did not give up on the Earth habit of keeping time, Willard dreamed of the days he had known on Earth. In his mind's eye, he saw himself walking the streets of Arden and feeling the crunch of snow or the soft lap of rainwater under his feet. He heard again in his mind the voices of friends he knew. How beautiful and perfect was each voice. How filled with warmth and friendship. There was the voice of his beautiful wife whom he would never see again. There were the gruff and deep voices of his co-workers and scientists. Above all were the voices of the cities and the fields and the shops where he had worked. All these had their individual voices. Odd that he had never realized it before, but things become clearer to a man who is alone. Clearer? Perhaps not. Perhaps they become more clouded. How could he, for example, explain the phenomena of the ghost ship? Was it really only a product of his imagination? What of all the others who had seen it? Was it possible for many different men under many different situations to have the same exact illusion? Reason denied that, but perhaps space itself denies reason. Grimly, he retraced the legend of the ghost ship. A chance phrase here and a story there put together all that he knew. Doomed for all eternity to wander in the empty star lanes, the ghost ship haunts the solar system that gave it birth. And this is its tragedy, for it is the home of spacemen who can never go home again. When your last measure of fuel is burnt and your ship becomes a lifeless hulk, the ghost ship will come for you. And this is all there was to the legend, merely a tale of some fairy ship told to amuse and to while away the days of a star voyage. Bitterly, Willard dismissed it from his mind. Another year of loneliness passed, and still another. Willard lost track of the days. It was difficult to keep time, for to what purpose could time be kept? Here in space there was no time, nor was there reason for clocks and records. Days and months and years became meaningless words for things that once may have had meaning. About 3 years must have passed since his last record in the logbook of the Mary Lou. At that time, he remembered, he suffered another great disappointment. On the port side, there suddenly appeared a full-sized rocket ship. For many minutes, Willard was half mad with joy, thinking that a passing ship was ready to rescue him. But the joy was short-lived, for the rocket ship abruptly turned away and slowly disappeared. As Willard watched it go away, he saw the light of a distant star through the spaceship. A heartbreaking agony fell upon him. It was not a ship from Earth. It was the ghost ship mocking him. Since then, Willard did not look out the window of his craft. A vague fear troubled him that perhaps the ghost ship might be there, waiting and watching, and that he would go mad if he saw it. How many years passed he could not tell, but this he knew. He was no longer a young man. Perhaps 15 years had disappeared into nothing. Perhaps 20. He did not know, and he did not care. Willard awoke from a deep sleep and prepared his bed. He did it not because it was necessary, but because it was a habit that had long been ingrained in him through the years. He checked and rechecked every part of the still functioning mechanism of the ship. The radio, even though there was no one to call, was in perfect order. The speed recording dials, even though there was no speed to record, were in perfect order. And so was every machine. All was in perfect order. Perfect, useless order, he thought bitterly, when there was no way whatever to get sufficient power to get back to Earth. Long forgotten Earth. He was leaning back in his chair when a vague uneasiness seized him. He arose and slowly walked over to the window, his age already being marked in the ache of his bones. Looking out into the silent theater of the stars, he suddenly froze. There was a ship coming toward him. For a moment, the reason in his mind tottered on a balance. Doubt assailed him. Was this the ghost ship come to torment him again? But no phantom this. It was a life and blood rocket ship from Earth. Starlight shone on it and not through it. Its lines, windows, vents were all solid and had none of the ghost-like quality he remembered seeing in the ghost ship in his youth. For another split second, he thought that perhaps he too, like Dobbin, had gone mad and that the ship would vanish just as it approached him. The tapping of the space telegrapher reassured him. "Calling spaceship Mary Lou," the message rapped out. "Calling spaceship Mary Lou." With trembling fingers that he could scarcely control, old Willard sent the answering message. "Spaceship Mary Lou replying. Received message. Thank God." He broke off, unable to continue. His heart was ready to burst within him, and the tears of joy were already welling in his eyes. He listened to the happiest message he had ever heard. Notice that spaceship Mary Lou is disabled and not spaceworthy. You are invited to come aboard. Have you spacesuit, and are you able to come? Willard, already sobbing with joy, could send only 2 words. Yes, coming! The years of waiting were over. At last he was free of the Mary Lou. In a dreamlike trance, he dressed in his spacesuit, pathetically glad that he had already checked every detail of it a short time ago. He realized suddenly that everything about the Mary Lou was hateful to him. It was here that his best friend died, and it was here that 20 years of his life were wasted completely in solitude and despair. He took one last look and stepped into the airlock. The Earth ship, he did not see its name, was only 100 yards away, and a man was already at the airlock waiting to help him. A rope was tossed to him. He reached for it and made his way to the ship, leaving the Mary Lou behind him forever. Suddenly, the world dropped away from him. Willard could neither see nor say anything. His heart was choked with emotion. "It's all right," a kindly voice assured him. "You're safe now." He had the sensation of being carried by several men and then placed in bed. The quiet of deep sleep descended upon him. He awoke many times in the following days, but the privations of the passing years had drained his strength and his mind, had made him so much of a hermit that the presence of other men frightened him to the point of gibbering insanity. He knew that the food and drink were drugged, for after eating he never remembered seeing the men enter the room to care for him and to remove the dirty dishes. But there was enough sanity in his mind to also realize that, without the gradual reawakening of his senses to the value of human companionship, he might not be able to stand the mental shock of moving about among his people back on Earth. During those passing days, he savored each new impression, comparing it with what he remembered from the age-long past when he and his friends had walked on Earth's great plains and ridden on the ocean's sleek ships, or flown with the wings of birds over the mountain ranges. And each impression was doubly enjoyable, for his memory was hazy and confused. Gradually, though, his mind cleared. He remembered the past, and he no longer was afraid of the men who visited him from time to time. But there was a strangeness about the men that he could not fathom. They refused to talk about anything, any subject, other than the actual running of the great ship. Always when he asked his eager questions, they mumbled and drifted away. And then in his 3rd week on the rescue ship, he went to sleep one night while peering from the porthole at the blue ball of Earth swimming in the blackness of space. He slept and he dreamed of the years he had spent by himself in the drifting, lifeless hulk of the Mary Lou. His dreams were vivid, peopled with men and women he had once known, and were horrible with the fantasies of terror that years of solitary brooding had implanted deep in his mind. He awoke with a start, and a cry of alarm ran through him as he thought that perhaps he might still be in the Mary Lou. The warm, smiling face of a man quickly reassured him. "I'll call the captain," the spaceman said. "He said to let him know when you came to." Willard could only nod in weak and grateful acceptance. It was true. He pressed his head back against the bed's pillows. How soft! How warm! He yawned and stretched his arms as a thrill of happiness shot through his entire body. He would see Earth again. That single thought ran over and over in his mind without stopping. He would see Earth again. Perhaps not this year, and perhaps not the next, for the ship might be on some extra-Plutonian expedition. But even if it would take years before it returned to home base, Willard knew that those years would fly quickly if Earth was at the end of the trail. Though he had aged, he still had many years before him, and those years he vowed would be spent on Earth and nowhere else. The captain, a pleasant old fellow, came into the room as Willard stood up and tried to walk. The gravity here was a bit different from that of his ship, but he would manage. "How do you feel, spaceman Willard?" "Oh, you know me?" Willard looked at him in surprise, and then smiled. "Of course, you looked through the logbook of the Mary Lou." The captain nodded, and Willard noticed with surprise that he was a very old man. "You don't know how much I suffered there," Willard said slowly, measuring each word. "Years in space, all alone. It's a horrible thing." "Yes?" the old captain said. Many times I thought I would go completely mad. It was only the thought and hope that someday, somehow, an Earth ship would find me and help me get back to Earth. If it was not for that, I would have died. I could think of nothing but of Earth, of blue-green water, of vast open spaces, and the good brown Earth. How beautiful it must be now. A note of sadness, matched only by that of Willard's, entered the captain's eyes. I want to walk on Earth just once, then I can die. Willard stopped. A happy, dreamy smile touched his lips. When will we go to Earth? He asked. The captain did not answer. Willard waited, and a strange memory tugged at him. You don't know, the captain said. It was not a question or a statement. The captain found it hard to say it. His lips moved slowly. Willard stepped back, and before the captain told him, he knew. Matter is relative, he said. The existent under one condition is non-existent under another. The real here is the non-real there. All things that wander alone in space are gradually drained of their mass and energy until nothing is left but mere shells. That is what happened to the Mary Lou. Your ship was real when we passed by 20 years ago. It is now like ours, a vague outline in space. We cannot feel the change ourselves, for change is relative. That is why we became more and more solid to you, as you became more and more faint to any Earth ship that might have passed. We are real to ourselves, but to some ship from Earth which has not been in space for more than 15 years, to that ship, to all intents and purposes, we do not exist. Then this ship, Willard said, stunned. You and I and everything on it are doomed, the captain said. We cannot go to Earth for the simple reason that we would go through it. The vision of Earth and green trees faded. He would never see Earth again. He would never feel the crunch of ground under his feet as he walked. Never would listen to the voices of friends and the songs of birds. Never, never, never. Then this is the ghost ship, and we are the ghosts. Yes.
The Medici Boots by Pearl Norton Sweat, read by Quartertone. For 50 years, they lay under glass in the Dickerson Museum, and they were labeled the Medici Boots. They were fashioned of creamy leather, pliable as a young girl's hands. They were threaded with silver, appliqued with sapphire silks and scarlet, and set on the tip of each was a pale and lovely amethyst. Such were the Medici Boots. Old Silas Dickerson, globe-trotter and collector, had brought the boots from a dusty shop in Florence when he was a young man filled with a lust for travel and adventure. The years passed, and Silas Dickerson was an old man, his hair white, his eyes dim, his veined hands trembling with the ague that precedes death. When he was 90 and the years of his wanderings over, Silas Dickerson died one morning as he sat in a high-backed Venetian chair in his private museum. The 14th century gold-leaf paintings, the Japanese processional banners, the stolen bones of a Normandy saint, all the beloved trophies of his travels, must have watched the dead man impassively for hours before his housekeeper found him. The old man sat with his head thrown back against the faded tapestry of the Venetian chair, his eyes closed, his bony arms extended along the beautifully carved arms of the chair, and on his lap lay the Medici Boots. It was high noon when they found him, and the sun was streaming through the stained glass window above the chair and picking at the amethysts, so that the violet stones seemed to eye Martha, the old housekeeper, with an impudent glitter. Martha muttered a prayer and crossed herself before she ran like a scared rabbit with the news of the master's death. Silas Dickerson's only surviving relatives, the 3 young Delameters, did not take too seriously the note which was found among the papers in the museum's desk. Old Silas had written a note. It was addressed to John Delameter, for John was his uncle's favorite, but John's pretty wife Suzanne and his twin brother Dr. Eric read it over his shoulder, and they all smiled tolerantly. Old Dickerson had written of things incomprehensible to the young moderns. "The contents of my private museum are yours, John, to do with as you see fit. Merely as a suggestion, I would say that the Antiquarian Society would snap up many of the things. A very few are of no particular value except to me. One thing I want done, however. The Medici boots of ivory leather must either be destroyed or be put forever under glass in a public museum. I prefer that they be destroyed, for they are a dangerous possession. They have gone to the adulterous rendezvous celebrated in the scandalous verses of Lorenzo the Magnificent. They have shod the feet of a murderess. They were cursed by the church as trappings of the devil, inciting the wearer to foul deeds and intrigue. I shall not disturb you with all their hideous history, but I repeat, they are a dangerous possession. I have taken care to keep them under lock and key behind plate glass for more than 50 years. I have never taken them out. Destroy the Medici boots before they destroy you.
But he did take them out, cried Suzanne. Uncle was holding the boots when Martha found him there in the museum.
John reread the note and looked thoughtfully at his young wife. Yes, perhaps he was preparing to destroy them right then. Of course, I think the poor old fellow took things a bit too seriously. He was very old, you know, and Martha says he practically lived in this museum of his.
And why call a pair of old boots dangerous? Of course, we all know the Medicis were plenty dangerous, but the Medici boots, that's ridiculous, John. Besides...
Suzanne paused provocatively, her red lips pouting. She looked down at her trimly shod feet.
Besides, I'd like to try on those Medici boots, just once. They're lovely, I think.
John was frowning thoughtfully. He scarcely heard her suggestion. He spoke to Eric instead, and his voice seemed a bit troubled. I believe that Uncle was getting ready to destroy those boots that very morning he died. Else why should he have taken them from their case after 50 years?
Yes, I believe you're right, John, because that note is dated fully a month before Uncle's death. I think he brooded over leaving those boots to one he cared for. Poor old man.
I wouldn't call him so, Eric. He had his dreams of adventure realized more fully than most men. I think I'll do as he says. I'll destroy the Medici boots.
If you'd feel better about it,
assented his brother. But Suzanne did not speak. She was looking at her shoe, pursing her lips thoughtfully, seeing her feet encased in the gay embroideries of the Medici boots. John seemed relieved by his decision. Yes, I'd better do it. We'll be getting back to town in a few days. Old Erskine, you know, Uncle's lawyer, is coming down this afternoon. Then soon we'll be on the wings, Susie and I. Vienna, Paris, the Alps, thanks to Uncle.
Maybe you think I'm not thankful for my chance at a bit more work at Johns Hopkins, said Eric,
and they did not again speak of the Medici boots. The deaf old lawyer of the Dickerson estate arrived, and Suzanne, with the easy capability that was part of her charm, saw that he was made comfortable. At 7, there was a perfect dinner served on the awninged terrace outside the softly lit living room. The stars aided the 2 little rosy lamps on the table, and swaying willows beside a stone-encircled pool swung the incense of the garden about them. As dinner ended, John took from the pocket of his coat a small, limp leather book. He pushed back his dessert plate and laid the book on the table, tapping it with a finger as he spoke. This is the history of the Medici boots. It was in the little wall safe in the museum. After all Uncle said of the Medici boots, shall we read it? And turning to the old lawyer, he told of Silas Dickerson's letter concerning the boots. Erskine shook his head, smiling. Most collectors get an exaggerated sense of the supernatural. Read this by all means. It should prove interesting. Yes, read it, John. Suzanne and Eric spoke almost together. So, in the circle of rosy light at their little table, John read the story of the Medici boots. It was not a long story, and it was told in the language of an anonymous translator, but as John read on, his listeners were drawn together as by a spell. They scarcely breathed, and the summer night that was so mildly beautiful seemed to take on a sense of hovering danger. In the palace of Giuliano de' Medici I have lived long. I am an old woman now, as the years are reckoned in this infamous place, though I am but 53. Separated from my betrothed, duped, sold into the marble labyrinth of this hateful place, it was long before my spirit broke, and I went forth, bejeweled and attired in elegance, among the silk-clad Florentines. I was labeled the most beautiful mistress of any of the Medici. I was smirked at, fawned upon for my lord's favors, obscenely jested about in the orgies that took place in the great banquet hall of the palace. But in my heart always lay the remembrance of my lost love, and in my soul grew black hatred for the Medici and all their kind. I, who had dreamed only of a modest home, a kind husband, black-haired, trusting little children, was made a tool of the Medici infamy. In time, I almost felt myself in league with the devil. Secretly, and with a growing sense of elation, I made frequent rendezvous with a foul hag whose very name was anathema to the churchly folk of Florence. In her hole of a room in a certain noisome street, she imparted to me those terrible secrets of the black arts which were deep in her soul. It was amusing that she was paid in Medici gold. The corruption of the Medici bred in them fear, in me a sort of reckless bravery. It was I who poisoned the wine of many of a foe of the Medici. It was I who put the point of a dagger in the heart of the old Prince de Vittorio, whose lands and power and palaces were coveted by my lord Giuliano. After a time, bloodshed became an exhilaration to me. The death agonies of those who drank the poisoned cup became more interesting than the flattery of the Medici followers. Even the ladies of the house of the Medici did me the honor of their subtly barbed friendliness. Through this very friendliness, I conceived my plan of sweet revenge upon the monsters who had ruined my life. With so great a hatred boiling in my soul that my mind reeled, my senses throbbed, my heart rose in my throat like a spurt of flame, I cursed 3 things of exquisite beauty with all the fervor of my newly learned lessons in devilish lore. These 3 beautiful objects I presented to 3 ladies of the house of Medici, presented them with honeyed words of mock humility. A necklace of jeweled links. I pledged myself to the devil and willed that the golden necklace would tighten on the soft throat of a lady of the Medici while she slept and strangle her into black death. A bracelet of filigree and sapphires, to pierce by its hidden silver needle the blue vein of a white Medici wrist, so that her life's blood would spurt and she would know the terror that the house of the Medici gave to others. Last and most ingenious, a pair of creamy boots, pliable, embroidered in silver and silks, encrusted with amethysts, my betrothal jewels. In my hatred I cursed the boots, willing that the wearer, as long as a shred of the boots remained, should kill as I had killed, poison as I had poisoned, leave all thoughts of home and husband, and live in wantonness and evil. So I cursed the beautiful boots, forgetting in my hate that perhaps another than a Medici might, in the years to come, wear them and become the devil's pawn even as I am now. In my life, the Medici will have the boots, of that I feel sure. But after that, I can only hope that this bloody history of the boots may be found when I am no more, and may it be a warning. I have lived to see my gifts received and worn, and I have laughed in my soul to see my curses bring death and terror and evil to 3 Medici women. I know not what will become of the golden necklace, the bracelet, or the boots. The boots may be lost or stolen, or they may lie in a Medici palace for age on age, but the curse will cling to them till they are destroyed. So I pray that no woman save a Medici will ever wear them. As I live and breathe, and do the bidding of the lords of Florence, the accursed Medici, I have told the truth. When I am dead, perhaps they will find this book, and in hell I shall know and be glad. Maria Modena di Cavour, Florence, 1476. "Whew!" said old Erskine. John laughed. "I don't suppose this charming history would have been any more thrilling if I had read it from the original book, in Italian, of course. Wonder where Uncle got it. There was no mention of it being in the library, but there it was." "Now will you destroy those boots?" asked Eric, and he was not entirely in jest. But Suzanne said, laughingly, "Not before I find out if the Medici lady had a smaller foot than I. Are they still in the museum, John? Never you mind, my dear. They're not for the likes of you. Oh, don't be silly, John. This is 1935, not the 15th century. And they laughed at Suzanne's earnestness. The book that held the story of the Medici boots lay on the white cloth, looking like a book of lovely verse. Suzanne, a small white blur against the summer dark, sat quietly while the men talked of Silas Dickerson, his life, his mania for collecting, his death that had so fittingly come to him in his museum. It was nearly 12 when Suzanne left the men on the terrace and with a quiet good night entered the living room and crossed to the long shining stairs. The men went on with their talk. Once, John, looking toward the jutting wing that was the museum, exclaimed, "Look at that, will you? Why, I'd swear I saw a light in the museum." "You locked it, didn't you?" asked Eric. "Of course. The key's in my desk upstairs. I'm probably mistaken, but it did seem as though a light shone there just a moment ago." "Reflection from the living room window, I think. Country life is making you jittery, John." And Eric laughed at his brother. The men sat on, reluctant to leave the beauty of the night, and it was almost 2 o'clock when they finally went inside. John said, "I think I'll not disturb Suzanne," and he went to sleep in a wide 4-postered bed in a room next to his wife. Eric and the old lawyer were in rooms across the hall. The summer night closed about the house of Silas Dickerson, and when the moon lay dying against the bank of cloud, puffed across the sky by the little wind that came before dawn, young Dr. Eric Delameter awoke, suddenly and completely, to a feeling of clammy apprehension. He had not locked his door, and now, across the grayness of the room, he saw it slowly opening. A hand was closed around the edge of the door, a woman's hand, small and white and jeweled. Eric sat straight and tense on the edge of his bed, peering across the room. A woman, young and slender, in a long trailing gown, came toward him, smiling. It was Suzanne. With a gasp, Eric watched her approach till she stood directly before him. "Suzanne, you are asleep? Suzanne, shall I call John?" He thought that perhaps he should not waken her. There were things one must remember about sleepwalkers, but physicians scarcely believed them. Eric was puzzled, too, by her costume. It was not a night robe she wore, but an elaborate trailing dress upon which embroideries in silver shone faintly. Her short black curls were bound about 3 times with strands of pearly beads. Her slim white arms were loaded with bracelets. The pointed toes of little shoes peeped beneath her gown, little shoes of creamy leather. An amethyst gleamed on each shoe. The sight of these amethystine tips affected Eric strangely, much as though he had looked at something hideously repulsive. He stood up and put out a hand to touch Suzanne's arm. "Suzanne," he said gently, "let me take you to John, shall I?" Suzanne looked up at him, and her brown eyes, usually so merry, were deeply slumbrous, not with sleep, but with a look of utter abandon. She shook her pearl-bound head slowly, smilingly. "No, not John. I want you, Eric." "Mad! Suzanne must be mad," was Eric's quick thought, but her caress was swifter than his thought. Both jewel-laden arms about his neck, Suzanne kissed him, her red lips pouting warmly upon his. "Suzanne, you don't know what you're doing." He grasped both her hands in his, and with a haste that would have seemed ludicrous to him had he viewed the scene in a picture play, he hurried her out of his room and across the hall. Eric opened her door softly, and with no gentle hand shoved Suzanne inside her room. She seemed like a little animal in his grasp. She hissed at him, clawed and scratched at his hand. But when he had shut the door, she did not open it again, and after a moment he went back to his own room. His mouth set in a firm line, his heart beating fast, Eric locked his door with a noiseless turn of the key. It was almost dawn, and the garden lay like a rare pastel outside his window, but Eric saw none of it. He scarcely thought, though his lips moved, as if chaotic words were struggling for utterance. He looked down at his hand where 2 long red scratches oozed a trickle of blood. After he had washed his hand, he lay down on his bed and covered his eyes with his arm against the picture of Suzanne. Above all else, there stood out the gleaming tips of her little shoes as he had glimpsed them through the dim light of his room when she came toward him. She wore the Medici boots! The Medici boots! Suzanne must have taken them from the museum! Over and over he said it. The Medici boots! The Medici boots! Eric rather dreaded breakfast, but when he came down at 8 to the terrace where a rustic table was set invitingly, he found John and the lawyer awaiting him. John greeted his brother affectionately. "Morning, old boy. Hope you slept well. Why so solemn? Feeling seedy?" No, I am perfectly all right," Eric replied hastily, relieved that Suzanne was not present. He added with a scarcely noticeable hesitation, "Suzanne not coming down?" "No," replied John easily. "She seemed to want to sleep a while. Sent her regrets. She'll see us at lunch." John went on, "I certainly had a nightmare last night. Thought a woman in a long, shining dress came into my room and tried to stab me. This morning I found that a glass on my bed table was overturned and broken, and by George I'd cut my wrist on it." He showed a jagged cut on his wrist. "Take a look, Dr. Eric." Eric looked at the cut carefully. "Not bad, but you might have bled to death had it been a quarter of an inch to the left. If you like, I'll fix it up a bit for you after breakfast." Eric's voice was calm enough, but his pulse was pounding, his heart sick. All morning he rode through the countryside adjoining the Dickerson estate, but he let the mare go as she liked and where she liked, for his mind was busy with the events of the hour before dawn. He knew that the slash on his brother's wrist was made by steel, not glass. Yet when the ride was over, he could not bring himself to tell John of Suzanne's visit. "She must have been sleepwalking, though I can't account for the way she was decked out. I've always thought Suzanne extremely modest in her dress, certainly not inclined to load herself with jewelry. And those boots! John must get them today and destroy them, as he said. Silly, perhaps, but—" His thoughts went on and on, always returning to the Medici boots in spite of himself. Eric came back from his ride at 11 o'clock with as troubled a mind as when he began it. He almost feared to see Suzanne at lunch. When he did meet her with John and Mr. Erskine on the cool shaded porch where they lunched, he saw there was nothing to fear. The amorous, clinging woman of the hour before dawn was not there at all. There was only the Suzanne whom Eric knew and loved as a sister. Here again was their merry little Suzanne, somewhat spoiled by her husband, it is true, but a Suzanne sweetly feminine, almost childish in a crisp white frock and little low-heeled sandals. Their talk was lazily pleasant, of tennis honors and horses, of the prized delphiniums in the garden, of the tiny Maltese kitten which Suzanne had brought up from the stable late that morning and installed in a pink-bowed basket on the porch. She showed the kitten to Eric, handling its tiny paws gently and hushing its plaintive mews with ridiculous pet names. "Perhaps I'm a bigger fool than I know. Perhaps it never happened except in a dream," Eric told himself unhappily. "And yet—" He looked at the red marks on his hand, marks made by a furious Suzanne in that hour before dawn. Too, he remembered the cut on John's wrist, the cut so near the vein. Eric declined John's invitation to go through the museum with him that afternoon, but he said in a queer sense of diffidence, "While you're there, John, you'd better get rid of the Medici boots. Creepy things to have around, I think." "They'll be destroyed, all right, but Suzanne is just bound to try them on. I'll get them, though, and do as Uncle said." Eric remained on the terrace, speculating somewhat on just what John and Suzanne would do now that the huge fortune of Silas Dickerson was theirs. Eric was not envious of his brother's good luck, and he was thankful for his share in old Silas's generosity. At 5 o'clock he entered the hall just as Suzanne hurried in from the kitchen. She spread out her hands laughingly. "With my own fair hands I've made individual almond tortinis for dessert. Cook thinks I'm a wonder. Each masterpiece in a fluted silver dish, silver candies sprinkled on the pink whipped cream. Oh! She made big eyes in mock gluttony. Eric forgot for a moment that there ever had been another Suzanne. You're nothing but a little girl, Susie. You with your rhapsodies over pink whipped cream. But it's sweet of you to go to such trouble on a warm afternoon. See you and the whatever you call them's at dinner. They're tortonis, Eric. Tortonis. Suzanne ran lightly up the stairs. Eric followed more slowly. He entered his room thinking that there were some things which must be explained in this house with the old museum. 20 minutes before dinner, Eric and John were on the terrace waiting for Suzanne. John was talkative, which was just as well, as he might have wondered at his brother's silence. Eric was torn between a desire to tell his brother his reluctant suspicions concerning the Medici boots and Suzanne, and his inclination to leave things alone till the boots could be destroyed. He said diffidently, John, has Suzanne those boots? John chuckled. Why, yes, I saw them in her room. Do you know she went down to the museum last night and took those boots? It was a light I saw in the museum. It was her light. Suzanne has ideas. Wants to wear the boots just once, she says, to lay the ghost of this, what's-her-name, Maria Modena. Suzanne says she couldn't sleep much last night. Got up early and tried on those boots. Well, I think I'll destroy 'em tomorrow. Uncle's wish, so I'll do it. Tried them on, did she? Well, if you should ask me, I'd say that the history of the boots was a bit too exciting for Suzanne. It was a haunting story. Uncle must have swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, eh? Of course. His letter showed that. But Suzanne lives in the present, not the past, as Uncle did. I suppose Suzanne will wear those boots, or she won't feel satisfied. I don't exactly like the idea, I must confess. Something like an electric shock passed through Eric. He said somewhat breathlessly, I don't think Suzanne ought to have the Medici boots. John looked at him curiously and laughed. I never knew you were superstitious, Eric. But do you really think... I don't know what I think, John, but if she were my wife, I'd take those boots away from her. Uncle may have known what he was talking about. Well, I think she's intending to wear them at dinner, so prepare to be dazzled. Here she is now. Greetings, sweetheart. Suzanne swept across the terrace, her gown goldly shimmering, pearls bound about her head, as Eric had seen her in the dim hour before dawn. Again the rows of bracelets were weighting her slim arms, and she wore the Medici boots, the amethyst tips peeping beneath her shining dress. John, ever ready for gay clowning, arose and bowed low. Hail, Empress! Ah, the dress you got in Florence on our honeymoon, isn't it? And those darned Medici boots. Suzanne unsmilingly extended her hand for him to kiss. John arched an eyebrow comically. What's the matter, honey? Going regal on me? And, retaining her hand, he kissed each of her fingers. Suzanne snatched away her hand, and the glance she gave her husband was one of venomous hauteur. To Eric, she turned a look that was an open caress, leaning toward him, putting a hand on his arm as he stood beside his chair, stern-lipped, with eyes that would not look at John's hurt bewilderment. The three sat down then, in the low wicker chairs, and waited for dinner. 3 people with oddly different emotions. John was hurt, slightly impatient with his bride. Eric was furious with Suzanne, though there was in his heart the almost certain knowledge that the Suzanne beside them on the terrace was not the Suzanne they knew, but a cruelly strange woman, the product of a sinister force unknown and compelling. No one, looking on Suzanne's red-lipped and heavy-lidded beauty, could miss the knowledge that there was a woman dangerously subtle, carrying a power more devastating than the darting lightning that now and then showed itself over the treetops of the garden. Eric began to feel something of this, and there shaped in his mind a wariness, a defense against this woman who was not Suzanne. No al fresco dining tonight, said John, as the darkening sky was veined by a sudden spray of blue-green light. Rain on the way. Pretty good storm, I'd say. I like it, replied Suzanne, drawing in a deep breath of the sultry air. John laughed. Since when, sweetheart? You usually shake and shiver through a thunderstorm. Suzanne ignored him. She smiled at Eric and said in a low tone, And if I should lose my bravery, you would take care of me, wouldn't you, Eric? Before Eric could reply, dinner was announced, and he felt a relief and also a dread. This dinner was going to be difficult. John offered an arm to his wife, smiling at her, hoping for a smile in return, but Suzanne shrugged and said in a caressing voice, "Eric?" Eric could only bow stiffly and offer his arm, while John walked slowly beside them, his face thoughtful, his gay spirits gone. During dinner, however, he tried to revive the lagging conversation. Suzanne spoke in a staccato voice, and her choice of words seemed strange to Eric, almost as though she were translating her own thoughts from a foreign tongue. And finally, Suzanne's promised dessert came, cool and tempting in its silver dishes. Eric saw a chance to make the talk more natural. He said gaily, "Johnny, your wife's a chef, a famous pastry chef. Behold the work of her hands. What did you say it was, Suzanne?" "This? Oh, I don't know what it's called." "But this afternoon, as you were leaving the kitchen, didn't you say it was almond something or other?" She shook her head, smiling. "Perhaps it is. I wouldn't know." The maid had placed a tray with the 3 silver dishes of dessert before Suzanne, that she might put on them the final sprinkling of delicate silver candies. Daintily, Suzanne sifted the shining bubbles over the fluff of cream. Eric, watching her, felt very little surprise when he saw Suzanne, with almost legerdemain deftness, sift upon one dish a film of pinkish powder which could not be detected after it lay on the pink cream. Waiting, he knew not for what moment, he watched Suzanne pass the silver dishes herself, saw her offer the one with the powdered top to John. And it was then that their attention was attracted by the entrance of the Maltese kitten. So tiny it was, so brave in its careening totter across the shiny floor, the small tail hoisted like a sail, that John and Eric laughed out loud. Suzanne merely glanced down at the little creature and turned away. The kitten, however, came to her chair, put up a tiny paw, and caught its curved claws in the fragile stuff of Suzanne's gown. Instantly, her face became distorted with rage, and she kicked out at the kitten savagely and with set lips. It seemed to Eric that the amethysts on the Medici boots winked wickedly in the light of the big chandelier. The kitten was flung some 10 feet away and lay in a small panting heap. John sprang up. "Suzanne, how could you?" He took the kitten in his arms and soothed it. "Why, its heart's beating like a trip hammer," he said. "I don't understand, Suzanne." As the kitten grew quiet, he took a large rose leaf from the table flowers and spread it with a heaping spoonful of the pink cream from his dessert. Then he put the kitten on the floor beside it. "Here, little one, lick this up. It's fancy eating. Suzanne's sorry. I know she is." The kitten, with the greed of its kind, devoured the cream, covering its small nose and whiskers with a pinkish film. Suzanne sat back in her chair, fingering her bracelets, her eyes on Eric's face. John watched the kitten, and Eric watched too, watched tensely, for he sensed what would happen to it. The kitten finished the cream, licked its paws and whiskers, and turned to walk away. Then it spun around in a frantic convulsion, and in a moment lay dead on its back, its tiny fed tongue protruding, its paws rigid. Outside, the storm glowered, and in the chartreuse light of the forked lightning, the great chandelier was turned to a sickly radiance. Thunder rolled like muffled drums. Suddenly, Suzanne began to laugh, peal after peal of terrible laughter, and then, with a glare of lightning, the big chandelier winked out. The room was plunged into stormy darkness, and they could hear the rain lashing through the garden to hurl itself against the windows. "Don't be frightened, Suzanne." It was John's solicitous voice, and it was followed by a quick movement from Suzanne's side of the table. A sheet of blue-green light illuminated the room for an instant, and Eric saw Suzanne struggling in her husband's arms, one jeweled arm uplifted, and in her hand a shining dagger. With a bound that was almost involuntary, Eric reached them and struck at the knife in Suzanne's hand. It clattered to the floor. And as though the fury of the storm and Suzanne's madness both were spent, the slashing rain and the lightning stopped abruptly, and Suzanne ceased to struggle. "Light the candles, Eric, quickly, on the mantel to your right. Suzanne is hurt. In the candlelight, palely golden and swaying, Eric saw Suzanne slumped limply in John's arms. The hem of her golden dress was redly wet, and one cream-colored little shoe was fast becoming soaked with blood from a slash across the instep. Let's get her over to the window seat, Eric. Do something for her. Oh, sweetheart, don't moan like that. There was no question or reproach in John's voice, only compassion. Eric took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves. His mouth was grimly set, his hands steady, his voice crisply professional. Take off those shoes, John. She'll be herself then. I mean that she'll be Suzanne, not a murderess of the Medicis. Take them off, John. They're at the bottom of this. You mean? John's voice was breathless, his lips trembling. I mean those hellish boots have changed Suzanne from a sweet and lovely girl to... Well, do as I tell you. I'll be back with gauze and some things I need. When Eric hurried back, there were 3 servants grouped at the dining room door. He spoke to them brusquely, and they left, wide-eyed and whispering. Eric closed the door. While the wet leaves tapped against the windows and stars struggled through the clouds, Eric worked, silently, expertly, grimly, by the light of a flashlight held in John's unsteady hands and the light of the flickering candles. The house lights were all snuffed out by the storm. There! Eric gave a satisfied grunt. The brothers stood looking at Suzanne, who seemed asleep. Her golden dress glimmered in the candlelight, and the pearls were slipping from her dark hair. The Medici boots lay in a limp and bloody heap in a corner where Eric had flung them. When she awakes, I shouldn't tell her about any of this if I were you, John. There are things you haven't told me, Eric, aren't there? Things about the Medici boots? Eric looked steadily at his brother. Yes, old fellow, and after I told you, those boots must be destroyed. We'll burn them before this night is over. We mustn't move her now. We'll go out onto the terrace. It's wet there, but the air is fresh. Did you smell something peculiar? For as they passed the corner where the Medici boots lay slashed and bloody, Eric could have sworn that there came to him a horrid odor, fetid, hotly offensive, the odor of iniquity and ancient bloody death.
Everyone who has travelled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they've always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and a line of distant woods. Then, I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck onto a red brick Queen Anne house, which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside, going up to the roof, which hall ought always to be provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library too, where you may find anything from a psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and perhaps most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was when it was first built, and in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, and not least now, when if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied, and life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses, and enough money to keep it together and entertain my friends in it modestly. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is Castringham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I've sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, old inside and out, park with fringe of woods and mere. The one feature that marked out the house from a score of others is gone. As you looked at it from the park, you saw on the right a great old ash tree growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, and almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling house built. At any rate, it had well nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of the offence really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual power of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the mere cruelty of the witch-finders. These are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved. And the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto-da-fe. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run-of-the-village witches, only being rather better off and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window, at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from under the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so, she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he'd made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the path in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night, he'd been at pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer for his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures at Bury St Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, then Deputy Sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life so in death, of a very different temper. Her poisonous rage, as a reporter of the Times puts it, did so work upon the bystanders, yea even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her that she presented the living aspect of a mad devil. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law, only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect, that as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said was the seemingly meaningless words, "There will be guests at the hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence of the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared then and afterwards that he could not give any other account of the matter than that he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him, but he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park, and walked to the hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home. So the vicar, Mr. Crowe, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of his regarding his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Crone thought of starting for home, about 9:30 o'clock, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crone was this. They were in sight of the ash tree, which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is it that runs up and down the stem of the ash? It is never a squirrel. They will all be in their nests by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its colour in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn he said, though it sounded foolish, that squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the two men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day, Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor yet at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I did not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and there they found their master, dead and black. So much you have guessed. That there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson. Mr. Crome himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He has left some notes among his papers, which show how genuine respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew, and there is also this passage, which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have it in this season. He had his evening drink of small ale, in a silver vessel, of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it. This drink was examined by the physician from Bury, and Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it, for, as was natural, in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse, there was talk made among the neighbours of poison. The body was very much disordered, as it laid in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave too probable conjecture that my worthy friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. What is as yet unexplained, and to myself the argument of some horrid and artful design in the perpetrators of this barbarous murder, was this, that the women which were entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it, being both sad persons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress both of mind and body, saying what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands, but they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which, with their whole forearms, in no long time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that as afterwards proved, during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no mark seen on the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able, by the help of a small magnifying lens of crystal, of the condition of the skin on this part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced. Remembering that ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of the horrid art of the Italian poisoners of the last age, so much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiments, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there is anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as in matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one used nightly, and upon his first rising to read a set portion, and I taking it up, not without a tear duly paid to him, which from the study of this poorer adumbration was now passed to the contemplation of its great original. It came into my thoughts, as at such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old and by many counted superstitious practice of drawing the swords, of which a principal instance, in the case of his late sacred majesty the blessed martyr King Charles, and by Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must needs admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me. Yet, as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched out, I set down the results, in the case it may be found that they pointed the true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I then made 3 trials, opening the book, and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in the first these words from Luke 7, "Cut it down." In the second, Isaiah 20, "It shall never be inhabited." And upon the third experiment, Job 30, "Her young ones also suck up blood." This is all that needs to be quoted from Mr. Crome's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crome on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of "The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger, and the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist," it being the vicar's view, as well as that most commonly held in the neighbourhood, that the squire was the victim of a recrudescence of the popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates. And so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room in which his father had died, nor indeed was it slept in by anyone but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the details will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it, at last, by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night, and keeping no sheep in his park, for he noticed that nothing was ever attacked that spent the night indoors. After that, the disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chase, but as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built on the north side of the parish church, so large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on the plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Crome. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed, and the feeling of surprise and indeed disquiet was very strong when it was found that, although her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside it of a body, bones or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying, no such things were dreamt of as resurrection men, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body, otherwise than for the uses of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials, and of the exploits of the witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. Before his time the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard had travelled in Italy and become infected with the Italian taste, and having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar masked the brick. Some different Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's Temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the Mere, and Castringham took on an entirely new, and I must say, a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired, and served as a model to a good many of the neighbouring gentry in after years. One morning, it was in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney smoked persistently, yet it was so cold that he must keep up a fire. Also something had so rattled about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of the distemper, which continued among his game, had lately been so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He could certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject at breakfast, and after it he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that with a northern. This door the servants would always be passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard, you know that there is but the one room like that in the house." "Which may that be?" said Sir Richard. "And that is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there I'll lie tonight," said her master. "Which way's it?" "Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there these 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke, and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and indeed the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and impatiently, as was his wont, threw the shutters back, and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, grown up as it was with the great ash tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chiddock, all today, and move my bedroom furniture in the afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice, breaking in on this speech, "might I have the favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round, and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will perhaps hardly remember me. My name is William Crome, and my grandfather was vicar here, in your grandfather's time." "Well, sir," said Richard, "the name of Crome is always a passport to Castringham. I am glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations standing. In what can I serve you for your hour of calling? And if I do not mistake you, your bearing shows you to be in some haste. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds, with what haste I can make, and I have called in on my way to leave you with some papers, which we have just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left after his death. It is thought you may find some matters of family interest in them. You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crome, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlour, and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these same papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, will be airing this chamber. Yes, it is here my grandfather died. Yes, the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not wish to listen to any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir?" They went to the study, the packet which young Mr. Crome had brought, who was then just became a fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I may say, and subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Polyenus, contained among other things the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical Source Biblicae, which you have heard. They amused him a good deal. "Well," he said, "my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, you may be rest assured I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of guitars and args was never seen." The parlour contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. "I wonder," says he, "whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him." Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which sure enough bore on the fly-leaf the inscription, "To Matthew Fell, from his loving godmother, Anne Aldous, 2nd of September, 1659. It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crome. I wager we get a couple of names in the Chronicle. What have we here? "Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be." Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, eh? No more profits for me. They are all in the tale. And now, Mr. Crome, I am infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray, allow me another glass. So with offers of hospitality, which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Hervey, Sir William Kentfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace and talking over the alterations and improvements in the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room. "You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why is that, my lord?" "It is in fact my own." "Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree, and you have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps," the bishop went on with a smile, "it has given you a touch of its quality already. For you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you. That, or something else, it is true, cost me my sleep from 12 to 4, my lord. But the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much more from it. I applaud your determination. It can hardly be wholesome to have the air you breathe strained, as it were, through all that leafage. Your lordship is right there, I think. But I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass, that kept me open-eyed." "I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you see from this point. None of these nearest branches even can touch your casement, unless there was a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot." "No, sir, true. What then will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so, eh, and covered the dust on my sill with lines and marks?" At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly. The night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms, and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we are in his bedroom, with the light out, and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside, still and warm, so the window stands open. There is very little light about the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro, with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive in the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which move back and forward, even as low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There, something drops off the bed, with a soft plump, like a kitten, and is out of the window in a flash. Another, 4, and after that, there is quiet again. Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. As with Sir Matthew, so with Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, popish emissaries, infected air. All these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tomcat was crouching, looking down the hollow which years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly, it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that the cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell as came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams there were, the witnesses are not sure which, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Hervey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir Richard Kentfield stayed, yet even they were daunted, though it was only at the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up, and looking down the hollow, could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern, and let it down by a rope. "We must get at the bottom of this, my life upon it, my lord, but the secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern, and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing, before he cried out in a dreadful voice and fell back from the ladder, where happily he was caught by 2 of the men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. By then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken at the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there. For in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the Bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for clearly whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First at the fork, they saw a round body covered with fire, the size of a man's head, appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times. Then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where after a moment it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to it, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, veinous and seared. And as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with greyish hair. All that day the ash burnt, and until it fell to pieces, the men stood about, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. They found, says the Bishop of Kilmore, below it a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures, that had plainly been smothered by the smoke. And what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching the anatomy, or skeleton, of a human being, with the skin dried upon the bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years.